students. I hope you're all doing well, staying warm on these very, very cold days. This has been so unusual. We haven't had weather like this in pretty much as long as I can remember, at least 30 years. Yeah, so, okay. So since we can't have class, we're going to do this lecture. This is recorded for you, so you can stop this if you want. And try to back it up if you need to hear something over again or something like that. But what we're going to do, y'all, is we're going to continue talking about soil. As you know, we started last week looking at weathering and erosion and how soil, where it comes from. We're going to build on that today, okay? So we're going to talk about specifically about the soil and where it comes from. All right, so what is it? We already know the answer to this. It's the loose covering of fine rock particles on the surface of the earth. And it is a heterogeneous mixture of minerals, rock, and humus. So you know what minerals, rock, and do you remember what humus is? Remember, that's the organic materials that's found in there that's been broken down by certain bacteria and fungi that are there. You can see this leaf sticking up right over here. So that's part of the humus. So what about that word heterogeneous? We're going to look into that a little more with a little more detail. It turns out that word means to be made up of different stuff, okay? So you look at one part, it might be looking different from another part of the dirt. If you looked at something that would be considered homogeneous, you would look at something that's the same all around. So if I gave you a glass of water and you looked at the water at the top of the glass and water at the bottom of the glass, it would look like water. That's homogeneous. That means the same. But if I gave you a beaker full of, say, Italian salad dressing, that would look different, right? It would have, and say I had shaken it up really well, and all those parts would be suspended in there, right? So one part might not look the same as another part. That's heterogeneous. So hetero means different. All right. We looked at the levels or the horizons of the soil last time we got together. And we're going to see now how that ends up forming. This is a theory of how these horizons form over time. For instance, if we have an area, there was an area in America, in Oklahoma and the panhandle of Texas in the 1930s that went through a very difficult time called the Dust Bowl. And what happened there is we had a lot of wind that came through there, and there was a drought. So there wasn't any rain. And because there wasn't any rain and there was a lot of wind, the wind picked up the dirt and blew it away. It blew the topsoil completely away. And so we can look at that now and see that bedrock was left bare, and then it took lots of time for that to regain its soil. So one of the ways the soil gets back there, of course, is that wind will bring some of it back. That's one way. But also here we're looking at this, what is known as the sea horizon. Okay, so we're looking at box number 1 over here. So we have bedrock underneath here. Well, after time goes by, some of that bedrock is going to break down. There will be rain, there will be wind, there will be, even if you have ice, we know about ice now, right? We have stuff frozen outside. We're going to see the power of that. I hope all of you have protected your pipes at your house, because what happens when water freezes is it expands, and when it expands it can break your pipes in your house. Then when it thaws, the pipes start to leak, right? Then you have a leak in your plumbing. So we can see that's going to create some changes in the Earth's surface as well. So over here it starts to weather. Remember what that means? The weathering, the rain, the snow, the wind will all serve to break down that bedrock right here and start to break it into small particles called sediments, and those sediments become part of soil. Now, as time goes by, we can see the A horizon that starts to develop when seeds fall into that dirt that's formed right here and start to grow in it. Okay, so we have organic material. Some of these plants will die and leave their organic material in there, and that's giving us some humus that's added to it. So that's how the A horizon forms above the C horizon. See how we still have some rocks in there. And then the B horizon forms as more time goes by. Rainwater brings in clay and other dirts and other minerals, and it starts to build upon itself like this, and then it starts to recreate those soil horizons. Okay, so the idea I told you about in Oklahoma and panhandle of Texas, the Dust Bowl, is a very unusual thing. Right now, like in your yard, for instance, these soil changes would be taking place all the time. So things are changing. In fact, you may have noticed these rocks actually can move themselves upward all by themselves by the motion of the earth, this kind of thing. So you may have been walking in a field and not noticed any rocks one day and go back and some rocks have popped up out of there. It's kind of fun to see that. And those will start to break down from weathering and contribute to minerals that are in the that'll end up in the soil. So there you go. It builds up that way. Now these are pictures kind of close up of different soils, and I wanted to show you that heterogeneous look to it. Okay, so let's look at this one. You can see there's some soil. You can see some little rocks in there, like little pebbles. So everything looks a little different here. We have different sediments over here with different colors. Down here we have a lot of, looks like organic material right here, maybe some leaves or plants or something like that, but also some little rocks and some dirt. Here we see some bigger rocks, some bigger pebbles, different colored dirts here. I see kind of green in here. I wonder about that. It could actually be some certain minerals that take on a green hue, or there could be maybe some algae or something growing in there. And then right up here you can see a bunch of different sized pebbles. So you can see how it's heterogeneous. It doesn't look the same all the way through. If we were meeting today, I would have some different types of soil for you to look at under the dissecting scope to see just how different it looks. I will bring that next week when we get together, so no worries, you won't miss anything. We'll have time next week to investigate what we were going to talk about this week, and then next week we'll mix it in with that. Okay, so we won't be missing anything. All right, so why do you want to study soil? Does it seem like an exciting science to get into? I think soil's fascinating, especially if you want to have a garden or something like that. You can get the good mixture of the soil to make for the best plants to grow. Like it's like having vitamins and things like that in there. Okay, so it is for crop production. We can see that's one of the reasons we should study soil, so we know how to make more successful crops. It is there are things living in it that absorb gases and produce gases. Some microorganisms and some different roots of different plants will help to take gases in the air and make them available to us. So here it says crop, here it says plants, so maybe they're not crops, maybe they're pretty, right? Trees and things like that. Plants, animals, and microorganisms live in here. It's very, very rich in microorganisms, including bacteria. It's a great natural resource. It filters. It does filter water naturally, so water that passes through it will end up getting cleaned by dirt. Doesn't that seem unusual? It's a source material. We need it in construction. Medicine, we get minerals out of it, that kind of thing. But for construction, you actually fill things so it gives it a nice solid base. Waste decomposer, that's mostly those microorganisms living in there. And then it gives us an idea of the health of the general area. So we can do some tests. In fact, when I built my house and my property, one of the first things the builder wanted was a soil test. And that was to see how movable the soil was. So they talk about elasticity with soil. Certain kind of soils can move more than other ones. And so if you're going to build a house on something, you know, the Bible talks about building a house on the rock versus building a house on sand. Well, the sand is shifting and moving, and if I have my house built only on sand, it might move around if there's some sort of erosion. My house, turns out there's a lot of clay, and clay gets very wet and does move around. So the builder was a little concerned about the moving of the house causing our foundation to crack and our walls to crack, and we have actually had some of that. It's been about 26 years I've been in my house. But we built a special type of a watering system around our house so it would keep it uniformly wet and therefore hopefully keep my house from moving around too much. And so that's why soil can be a very interesting subject to learn about. Okay, so what about the changes? We learned about this a little bit last time, and we're going to be talking more about it now. The surface of the earth is always changing. It has to do with that weathering. There are other things that cause surface of the earth to change, things like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, giant floods. All these things can cause the surface of the earth to change, sometimes much more quickly than you would imagine. Rocks are breaking down. That's usually a slow process, happens over time, right? But it's broken down into smaller pieces. Those will become part of the soil. And that's called weathering. We know that because typically it's weathering that causes that. But like I said, there could be large catastrophic events that will cause that kind of thing as well, the earthquakes and volcanoes and things. So typically, though, weathering is caused by the weather, by wind, water, ice, and roots. So let's look at a couple of those things. Water is the most obvious one. It flows over things. Okay, so as the water flows past things, it will change them. You've probably seen a creek or something that when the water was high and running fast, it may have taken some of the sides down and knocked part of it down and changed the look of the creek, right? It would change the sides of it and this kind of thing. It slowly wears it away. But also think about underneath, there would be rocks in the stream. As water runs over it, then it also washes sand and things over the rocks, and it actually makes the rocks very sanded looking. And I'll show you a picture here in just a minute. Which reminds me, next time we get together, we will be talking about rocks. And so therefore this soil will blend into that fairly easily, okay? So we'll be looking at the different kinds of rocks that are out there. So if the sharp edges of the rocks are worn away, the smaller things might be washed away, washed down to the river. And if you at a big river like the Mississippi River, at the very end of it, we have this thing called a delta, which is where all the sediments are dropped as it enters into the ocean. And so they call the Mississippi the Big Muddy, and that's because it leaves muddy sediments down, and it drops those muddy sediments into the Gulf of Mexico just to the north and east of Texas. And that's why the Texas coast seems kind of muddy, because we get that mud washed down from the Mississippi River. But stones in a creek where the water's running by it will end up looking like this. We call those pebbles, right? Notice how they have smooth edges. And so if you find a rock that's real smooth like that, you can pretty much guess that those came out from a riverbed or something like that. All right, nice and smooth. And next time we get together, we will be talking about rocks and looking at some smooth rocks like these. Wind erosion. So wind will weather rocks as well. It tends to pick up sand and things like that and hit them against the side of the canyons and things like this and really weather them away, almost like sandpaper. You can use sandpaper to smooth things off. It'll smooth off rocks as well. It sands them down, just like that says. And so you can see here's an example of that. So this has taken some time. Now, I remember last time one of you was asking why we have the layers. You can see these different layers in here. So the idea is these are called strata, and we believe those strata were laid down sometimes over time, where one strata was laid down, then much later another strata came and was laid on top of it. Or sometimes we see that it can happen very quickly if a giant flood moves through here, and the heavier things will end up on the bottom and lighter things will build up on top of them and make those layers that way. But then later in this particular region, the wind came through and hollowed out these areas. Very beautiful landscapes are made this way. That's still a part of weathering. And in fact, rain and flooding could have done this as well. Once the sand started sanding away the sides right here, water could have come through. They call that abrasion flooding. That could come, and abrasion means to take something rough and sand it off like sandpaper. It's a rough running through there. Ice erosion. So now we're thinking about ice right now because of all this snow we've had. So it turns out that, like I told you, ice, when it gets into pipes, it freezes, it expands and can break the pipes. Well, it can do the same thing to rocks. Rocks seem so very strong, but if there, say, is a crack in a rock and some water falls into that crack and then it freezes, it expands, and then it will actually be strong enough to crack that rock. I think I have a picture here. Yes, it's called wedging. You can see, water ended up in this little kind of crevice area here, and when it froze, it literally cracked that part off of the rock. That's amazing, isn't it, that it can have that much strength to it. And plants can do it too. Plants are more powerful than you might think. Okay, so their roots, you've probably even seen this. Sometimes if you go to a park or something and it has a lot of trees and things, you might end up seeing a sidewalk that's been moved up by some of the roots of the trees that are coming in there. So it is powerful enough to break rocks apart. So a seed might fall into a crack and start to grow there, And if it grows big enough, it can actually break through the rock. We can see right here. Look at that tree growing right through that rock right there. So that trunk of that, of course, the root was reaching down to the soil to go down and get water for the plant, and then it's going to grow up. So it looks like it's pretty successful, and it has broken through that rock right there. Fascinating. Okay, earthworms. So last time, you remember, we made our little cups with our pudding in it, right, that showed the levels of the soil. We had the bedrock, which was the one cookie, and then we had the broken cookies as those rocks that are in that next layer of soil. Then our pudding came in there to be the actual soil. And I guess we could have put some sort of dusting or something at the top to be our humus. And then we had our little gummy earthworm right there, right? So, and remember the video we watched about the giant earthworms? So now we're going to look at more earthworm stuff right here. So it turns out they're very, very beneficial to your soil. That means they're very good for your soil. And what they do is they crawl around through the soil, up and down, mixing the nutrients. And remember, of course, they're eating the soil, right? And as they eat it, it passes through their body, and then they get rid of the stuff they're not using. So they poop out that looks like soil there too. Remember looking at the dissected earthworm, you could see in his gut, it looked like dirt going all the way down there. And so they mix the soil from down below up higher, and then furthermore, they leave some of their waste products in there that actually is like a fertilizer for the soil as well. It loosens the soil. It makes that easier for plant roots to reach through it. I mentioned to you how I have very clay-like soil here that's in it. When it gets wet, it compacts really much. Think about clay that you've formed into something. It gets very, very compact, and it's hard for some roots to reach through there. So if the roots can get a hold, then they can reach in there and help break up that soil. But earthworms help a lot, all right? So they help by stirring that up. The nutrients are distributed. They're excellent for your garden. Here is a beautiful picture of an earthworm. Okay, they do like to be nice and wet. They do not like to dry out. In fact, drying out is probably one of the worst things that can happen to an earthworm. They live underground because they can go seek out the water down there. And as they do, they're mixing up those things. Now, when it rains, you may have noticed some worms coming to the surface. That's because sometimes their burrows and things that they're making will get overrun with water, and they can drown in there. So they have to come to the surface to get out of the too much water. Also, you may have heard them called night crawlers, because they tend to, in the nighttime, will come up to the surface to eat other things. They'll come to the surface to see if there's other little, organic material they might want to eat. You can look at this guy right here. This is his head right here. Okay, so we call that the anterior part of the earthworm. All right, and you can see the segments in here. And if we count those segments, when you get to about 36, we have this interesting little thing here called the clitellum. The clitellum is just a little piece of material that helps in reproduction. It turns out earthworms have boy parts and girl parts in there, but they do use this to help with that reproduction. And you can still see the segments coming down here. Now to the posterior end, so that's the bottom. Notice how it flattens out a little bit. Not all of them have that flattening part, but many of them do. And underneath, you can see those segments still here. Underneath of these guys, in order to move, they have these special little, they're kind of like hooks. I know that sounds weird, kind of like hooks. They're called setae, and they're really known as setae bristles. And what that does is it allows the earthworm to grab a hold of the ground and move along. If you've ever seen them moving. I have a video here to show you. All right, so this is if we were going to label the parts. Here's the anterior mouth. The anterior end has the mouth. And the dorsal surface just means the back of it. Underneath on the belly surface is called the ventral surface right here. So here are those different segments right here. The setae is referring to these little bristles I was telling you about, sort of like little hooks right there. And here's that clitellum, right? That's very noticeable on some, not as much on others. And then we get down to here to the posterior end, and then this is called the anus. That's where the poop comes out right there. So that's our external anatomy of our earthworm. Now I'm going to show you a video right here. This is an earthworm that has come to the surface on a wet day. This is wet cement right here. and it's going to be crawling along, and you'll see how it uses its setae to grip, and then it constricts its muscles and squishes up, and then it takes its body and then grabs the next place so it can move. You'll see how it moves really well here. Yeah, see the muscles constricting right there? There's that clitellum right there. And now it's going to move that ahead, and then grab with its setae, and there he goes. Look at those segments. Pretty cool looking, huh? You're going to see how big it is here in a second. There we go. And is the posterior end all the way in yet? The picture? Not quite. And there it is. Look how big that earthworm is. Isn't that great? Excellent. All right. Okay. All right, now we would start the lab. Now, typically, y'all have lots of questions for me. And so if you thought of any questions, I would love to answer those. So maybe you could get someone to write those down for you. You could write them down. You could send me an email if you wanted, or you can wait till next week and see if you had any questions. I was going to bring you some earthworms to look at today, actual living ones, not the dead ones, right? And we could kind of test them and see if there's certain things they like. And then we were going to look at soil. I have this thing called a soil separator. Some of my students have seen it, where we take a sample of soil and I shake them through different grids like screens, and we can see some big chunks in our soil and some smaller ones, and we get down to a very, very fine soil that is very homogeneous, right? It's all the same in those parts. We would also take some of that soil and put it into some water to see if it falls through at the same rate. We could also see if it makes clay. And then we were going to look at our earthworms. All right, we're going to see if we can check a few things. See if we can put a couple things down by their head to see if they looks like they smell it. Okay, we could also touch them very gently. I want to always be very careful with living things. I have a lot of respect for living things. But I will see if we can put all this together in our lecture for next week. Okay, we'll be looking at rocks, and so we'll just continue on our soil so we can look at all that and then start looking at rocks as well. Okay, y'all. So have a wonderful week. Keep reading. I know a lot of you are ahead. That's great. That's because I'm going so really slowly through parts of these lessons, and that's because I really enjoy doing the labs for them. And that's okay. It's always good for you to be ahead of me. I have no problem with that. All right. I will see you next week, and I sure hope y'all have a nice snow day out there. See you soon. Bye.